for them would have been diminished as well. Still thus would we hold in regard an entire world devoted to nothing but enjoyment. Imagine a society in which everyone has an electrode implanted in their brain, which, when a current is passed through it, causes intense euphoria unmatched by any other pleasure. One simply needs to be attached to a power source, and the simple push of a button yields ecstasy. And that is all anyone cares about. Agriculture, commerce, government, and social institutions are organized toward but one goal: to maximize the time each person can spend plugged in and lost in self-stimulation. Individual lives are conducted with the same aim. Work is still necessary, but held to a minimum, and contact with fellow human beings has no purpose other than to keep things running smoothly so that the pleasure of all can be maximized. Now, if the ideal with creation we are examining were correct, this type of society ought to represent a high order of human existence, better by far than the world in which we presently find ourselves. In fact, however, it represents a level of existence so low as to be barely human. The enterprises we value most would shrivel to near nothingness in such a world. There would be no art or culture, no important or meaningful public works, little technology and science, above all, no real human fellowship, no caring, no sacrifice. Perversely enough, in fact, all we have to add to a world like this is a war, and we get a situation not unlike Hobbes' state of nature, the very antithesis of anything we could value. You may remember Hobbes lamenting that there was no art or culture and so forth in the state of nature. Now, the lesson of these considerations is plain enough. To adopt the premise that the best sort of God would minimize all suffering is to approach the problem in a spirit that is decidedly wrong. It is to gesture in the direction of a world even brief examination discloses as beneath contempt, and then to blame God for not creating it. To do that is to delude ourselves. Rather, we need to realize that in any life we would consider good, suffering and the fact of suffering are bound to play a meaningful, even an indispensable part. Its purpose is neither punitive, necessarily, nor to serve as a mere means to some further good. Rather, suffering is there to be addressed. It is a challenge to be met and, if possible, defeated. The sense of defeat at issue here was made familiar by Roderick Chisholm. Evil that is defeated in this sense is not a mere means to good, nor is it simply overbalanced by a greater good. Rather, it becomes an intrinsic part of a larger state of affairs that constitutes a much greater good, but which would actually be less good if the evil were taken away. An excellent example of the defeat of evil can be found in Beethoven's having become the composer he was in spite of his deafness. Beethoven could have reacted to his encroaching deafness by despairing of further success as a musician. Instead, he went on writing even as his hearing faded to silence, producing many of his greatest works well after he was stone deaf. Here, the evil of Beethoven's deafness is not just overbalanced by a greater good, rather it is addressed and, so to speak, refuted in Beethoven's accomplishment, an accomplishment that would in fact have been diminished had it not been carried off in defiance of his deafness. Okay, so you have this great good, okay, of Beethoven being the composer he was, which would have been less good but for the evil that it included, namely, or that was defeated by it, namely the evil of his deafness. Okay. Now, the defeat of suffering is seldom this dramatic, but a central aspect of nearly all lives is the struggle to overcome the many hardships that regularly afflict humankind. And when such efforts are successful, they stand as a particularly satisfying kind of good, far more satisfying than mere happiness or most forms of worldly success. And what I want to claim is that, given the great value that attaches to the defeat of evil, it would be naive to expect suffering to be minimized in creation. Rather, if God's perfect goodness is to be manifested in the world, if he is to create the best of all possible worlds, we should expect that a major part of the enterprise of creation will be the confrontation and defeat of evil in all of its forms. If that is correct, then in addition to the great profusion of goods present in the world, and when we talk about the problem of evil, we tend to forget there's a lot of good stuff out there too, okay, there is, all right? But then in addition to those goods, there will also be found a degree and diversity of evil commensurate with the objective of its utter defeat. Indeed, if anything less were so, if as Creator God should shrink from some evil as too dismaying to face, too bitter to be endured, or too costly to overcome, he would already have fled the field, and the battle would be lost before it began. It is not fitting that as Creator God should suffer a failure of nerve. He should be as perfect in courage as in justice and love. If, furthermore, we humans are called to friendship with God, we should expect, especially if we respond positively to that call, that each of our earthly destinies will involve some degree of partnership with him in the defeat of suffering. No doubt, such a destiny will place us in frequent discomfort, perhaps at times even agony. Far better that, however, than to discover ourselves the inhabitants of a trivial universe of languishing enjoyment and unfettered ease, the cowardly children of a cowardly God. Okay, so how might evil then or suffering be overcome? Well, one way in which suffering can be defeated, a way in fact in which suffering taken generally is almost self-defeating, is by prompting us to take measures to diminish it. Now, suffering once it occurs cannot, of course, be taken away. The knowledge that others are in difficulty will often motivate us, however, to comfort them in their travail, to try to lessen the severity of it, and, as far as we can, to see to it that no one else endures the same plight. Now, a great deal of human energy is devoted to measures of this kind, in caring for the sick and injured, in research aimed at curing disease, and in countless efforts to assist and safeguard the elderly, the poor and disadvantaged, even lower animals. A lot of education also aims to further these ends, if only by making people better able to care for themselves and their families. It is important to realize that there is frequently a corporate or collective dimension to activities of this kind. Action aimed at easing suffering is often undertaken in concert with others and focused more toward the common lot of humankind than the fortunes of any particular person or persons. That is the nature of charities, service organizations, and any number of government-sponsored social programs. And even without the auspices of a formal organization, the beneficent efforts of diverse individuals may be interdependent, and they may understand them to be such, and medical research might be a good example of that. Now, the corporate aspects of efforts to diminish suffering is important for two reasons. First, it advances human solidarity. It is a commonplace that in times of prosperity and ease, people tend to draw away from one another, each becoming preoccupied with his own endeavors and objectives. In a crisis, by contrast, there is a powerful tendency to join in a common effort to set things right. The result, even if the effort fails, is almost always a pronounced increase in each person's sense of belonging, a reduction of alienation, and a reinforcement of mutual trust. The second important feature of corporate effort is that because the endeavor is shared by many, no one individual's portion need issue in success. Even small contributions can be important to a common cause, and those making them are able to have the satisfaction of being part of a great enterprise. Indeed, one can have this satisfaction if one only tries to do good, and an effort that fails to advance the cause even a little bit can still stand as an expression of goodwill and as an inspiration to other participants. Another point to notice is that just as activities aimed at reducing suffering may be collectively undertaken and aimed at a collective result, they and individual efforts as well are often collective or general in their inspiration. That is, they may be prompted not by any particular instance or set of instances of pain or sorrow, but simply by the general and broad-reaching reality of human and even animal tribulation. In this respect, there is no such thing as suffering that is completely gratuitous. Even the fictitious ordeal of the fawn caught in the forest fire, in William Rowe's famous example, has a place here. We may well be led by such tales to try to curtail the frequency and severity of natural calamities or to other efforts to reduce suffering generally, because such stories bring home to us the helplessness of innocent torment and the fact that such horrors occur far more often than we usually realize. Okay? Now, this is not to imply that each and every case is indispensable to our being thus inspired. One might easily claim that the frequency of innocent, excruciating torment is far in excess of what would be needed to prompt a sufficient level of effort to alleviate it. Though I must say I have no idea how that would ever be demonstrated. I mean, I can imagine somebody saying it could be twice as much, or should be twice as much, given our hardness of heart, you know, and that we'd try a lot harder if there was much more suffering than there is out there. Yeah? But that issue may be postponed for the moment. For now, we need only observe that we have no reason whatever to believe there is such a thing as suffering that serves in no way to prompt efforts to diminish or alleviate suffering, and very good reason to believe there is not. Okay. Now, the claim that suffering is defeated in part through our efforts to alleviate it may be greeted with some suspicion, for it will be protested, diminishment is not the same thing as defeat. An evil that is defeated is supposed to become part of a larger state of affairs that is a greater good, and of which the evil is an indispensable part. The mere diminishment of suffering does not in itself have this feature, nor by themselves do our efforts to reduce the sum of human and animal pain from what it otherwise would have been. In what then does the defeat consist? Well, it is, I think, twofold in nature, and I think that objection fails to understand the situation. On the point of diminishment, the defeat consists not in the lessening taken by itself, but in the larger situation in which the sufferings of some lead by their very nature to an improvement in the lot of others. This is a legitimate example of defeat, one moreover whose importance, I think, is too often underestimated. But for the accomplishments of others, all of our lives would be unimaginably different and incomparably poorer. True, persons presently in pain may not benefit from efforts at alleviating the human condition inspired by their particular difficulty. They will, however, have benefited from efforts the difficulties of others have inspired. All of us do. Indeed, anyone who lives in a warm house, who eats well, and enjoys the benefits of modern medicine, transportation, communication, and so forth, is living a life made better by countless activities on the part of the generations that have gone before us, activities that in fact improve the lot of humankind. And it would be unreasonable to think we're not often motivated, at least in part, by that aim. Not that that's necessary. Nothing about the motive is necessary to this particular form of defeat. Okay?